with a single thread and running it through the beeswax. Now I'm going to take very small stitches. These will be basically little slip stitches to close the neckline of the collar. You want to make a very, very fine knot. If you can't make a fine dressmaker's knot with your 2 fingers, then take both hands and make a single knot and cut very close to it and bury the knot under the collar. Now this area at the center front of both sides of the collar is kind of tricky. You'll learn. You want to take tiny stitches and make it nice and closed and very snug. So these are just little in and out stitches right here. And then when I go down around up to the shoulder and the back and back around to the other front, I'm going to do a slip stitch going through the fold in the collar and the seam of the neckline, and trying to keep all my stitches from going through to the outside of the fabric where my fingers are holding it. And here we go with the little slip stitches. They're about 1/8 to 3/16 of an inch away from each other. They're quite snug. You can take 2 or 3 and then pull your thread. I don't take too many because then it doesn't pull evenly, but sometimes I would rather take 2 or 3 at a time rather than just one. It just depends on exactly what area I'm working on and how refined or tiny the area is to work on. You can see that with my left thumb I'm rolling the fabric of the collar back just a little bit so that I can put the needle just under the fold. That way when I've pressed this area you should not see any stitches. These are some basting stitches that were done, and I want to bring those out so that they don't show in the final garment. weaving the needle in and out of the folds, and then pulling the thread so it's nice and snug, but not pulling it in so it's gathered. I'm not terribly happy where this area is. I've apparently pushed the fabric a little bit too far to the front, so it's not laying quite the way I would like it to. So I'm going to carefully take out just a little bit of it and resew it, and then sew to the very center front on this collar end. So burying my needle, and then I started this needle and thread where there were already some correct stitches, so I'm overlapping. And finally, finishing this side of the collar. You can see how the collar underneath it's a really smooth fit against the neckline. More threads. I'm being very careful not to smash where the collar meets the neckline. Now I'm not going to hit this with a lot of weight, but I am going to steam it a little bit. I don't want to smash the collar. And this, of course, is not the final press. Now, what I'm pinning is right into the seam. I don't want to hit steam on that or it will leave an impression, but that will keep the collar in place while I steam some of the rest of the collar. You can see by pulling it in both directions with my hands, I can make it rather taut, and then by steaming, it just has a much smoother look. So marking the wrong sides of the fabric for the sleeves, just so I don't get confused. It's pretty clear which is the right and wrong side. However, sometimes it's easy to make a mistake, so it's better just to chalk and be careful. These are 1/2-inch seams. I back tacked only one stitch, and it's always to back tack, it's sometimes good to start not at the very edge of the fabric, but come in 1 or 2 stitches and start with your back tack and then go forward. You have less likely of a chance of puckering the fabric that way. Let's press this seam open. First embed the stitches and then press it open. And now again, these have to have a facing because they are a curved hem. So this is a great way to finish the edge of the facing that is not sewn into the skirt, the one that will be the top of the hemline. I'll show you how to do this. Again, marking the wrong sides. The same seam allowance as the sleeve, 1/2 inch. I'm taking the interfacing and making the same 1/2 inch seam to put these together. Embedding all the stitches and then pressing the seams open. Now I want to orient myself so I don't stitch the wrong sides. So this is correct. It's the top of the facing where my finger is. That seam needs to be finished. I could just put the interfacing behind it and zigzag the top, but I'm going to show you a really beautiful way to finish this edge. I want to be sure to mark which the top of each side is. So it's so easy to get these things confused sometime and just sew them upside down and inside out in all kinds of crazy ways. So it's easier just to orient yourself before you start sewing. I'm putting the right sides together. I'm stitching at 1/4 of an inch or a fraction less. It doesn't really matter as long as you're doing both armhole facings the same or sleeve facings the same. If these fabrics were thick, what I would do is trim the seam allowance a little bit. Probably the fashion fabric, the blue fabric, I would trim down to be about 1/4 of an inch, the seam allowance, and the interfacing before I stitched it to the blue fabric, I would trim that down to about 1/8 of an inch. But these fabrics are extremely lightweight, so I don't really foresee any bulk in this area. Clipping all the way around to just above the seam line. Whoops, I clipped right through the seam there. So I just go a fraction more into the fabric to grab some fabric so it doesn't come apart. It happens. I'm pressing the seam allowance up towards the white interfacing. It would be very difficult on this small circular piece to press the seam open. You can do this on a hem, but this particular sleeve roll pressing piece is very, very handy for this. Now I'm going to roll this in, and just like the upper and under collar, I want the outer piece to roll in just a fraction. That way, if you look up into the sleeve while the model is wearing it, you won't see the white fabric. So it's just about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. What that does is push the white down, so I'll go back later and trim that off, because both the facing and the interfacing were cut from the same pattern. They're the same width. So now it's really a good idea to sew or baste the two fabrics together. This particular seam area is what I sew to the bottom of the sleeve, and I want to secure these fabrics before I do sew this to the sleeve. By securing these two fabrics together and then trimming this off, this will be basically what the understitching of a collar is. It helps hold it together in place when sewn into the garment, and you should probably never see the interfacing. Once you've rolled that blue fabric in, stitched the two together, and then trimmed off the excess. Now to sew the facing to the sleeve. So I'm putting the right sides together and matching the underarm seam. So the raw edges of the blouse sleeve and the sleeve facing are together. And the blues are matching. They're face to face, right sides together. If you noticed, I did not finish the edges of the seam allowance of the sleeves. And that's because the sleeve is very short and the underarm seam, where the raw seam allowance is, will be covered by the facing. So there's really no need to do anything. It's not fabric that falls apart easily anyway. So stitching at a 1/4 inch all the way around, starting at the underarm seam. Clipping the seam allowance. It's not a very deep curve, so I'm not making the clips too close, about 3/4 of an inch or so apart, maybe even an inch. And repeating the same process on this sleeve. Embedding the stitches with steam. pressing the seam allowance up into the facing area. You can see the top of the facing is beautifully finished. In a way, it's really one of the most beautiful facings, or finishing for facings. Rolling it in and giving it a final press. And again, I've rolled the seam in just a fraction of an inch so you do not see the seam from the outside while it's being worn. There you have it. I'm going to understitch the seam allowance to the facing, just like I did the under collar. This way, when this blouse is worn and hand washed or dry cleaned, it will not roll down. The facing will not roll down. This stay stitching or understitching will prevent it from rolling down. It will stay in place. And it's just about 1/8 of an inch from the actual seam. You could do it even closer to the seam if you'd like, 1/16 of an inch to 1/8. You can see I'm not putting too many pins in. I'm not going to put those pins real close to each other because it puckers the fabric up if you do. So this prepares the sleeve for the hand stitching at the hem. So I'm aligning the underarm seams of the sleeve and the facing, and then just gently pinning around every few inches to stabilize this for the handwork that I will do to hem the sleeve. And now with a single thread, I catch it a couple of times in the underarm seam. Now I'm doing a slant stitch, and I'm taking just a thread or two from the facing and going into the body of the sleeve. And I'm not making the stitches terribly close. They're about 3/4 of an inch. It depends on your fabric. If you're using a real slinky silk, you'll want to make them possibly a little bit closer because the fabric will kind of sag between the stitches. But this lovely cotton has a beautiful crispness to it, and I don't want to make the stitches too close because then they will possibly pucker. You'll have to just practice and see what works best for the fabric that you're using. And you can see by rolling the facing down and allowing it to stick above the fold of the sleeve, just a fraction, it makes the stitching go very quickly, and the stitches will not show from the outside when I have pressed everything. The stitches are going to be between the facing and the body of the sleeve. By taking several stitches on top of each other, it serves as knotting the fabric without having to put a knot in it. A little bit of steam. It's probably not a bad idea to always check or test using the wax on your fabric. I would take a scrap of your fabric, wax a thread and put it through the needle, and take a few stitches and iron it. If it leaves a mark with the wax, then be sure to wax the thread and then iron it between two pieces or a folded piece of muslin to take out the excess wax. And now to run some rows of gathering stitches from the notches at the underarm curve. I usually start about 1/2 inch before the notch and a fraction within the seam allowance. You can see where the number 4 is, and I'm trying to go just a little bit under that, all the way around the top of the cap and past the other notches. And doing a second stitching line at just about 1/4 inch, in about the middle of this marked by thread seam allowance. In other words, I did a 1/2 inch, and now I'm going in between the 1/2 inch and the edge, which is 1/4 inch. And these are basting stitches or gathering stitches, about 6 to 8 per inch. Again, you can always practice, take a scrap and practice and see what works for your fabric. So I'm trying to figure out which sleeve this is, the left or the right. The front of the armhole has, at the underarm curve, has 1 notch, and the back of the armhole and corresponding area of the sleeve has 2 notches. So I've determined that this is the right sleeve. I'm pinning it to the underarm of the body, right sides together. At the shoulder, I'm not happy with the pressing of that seam, so I'm going to press it a little bit more. Not too much pressure, mostly steam. And the seam allowance goes to the back. Matching the shoulder notches. And when I put the pin in, I'm being very careful not to stab through the thread. I've done that before. What happens is when you go to gather the sleeve, it just won't gather because you've stabilized it with a pin. Now, I'm going to be pulling the threads on the inside of the sleeve. So the threads on the outside, or the fashion side of the fabric, I can tie these off and cut them. That way they don't get in my way and I don't accidentally pull them, as well as the underarm or under the fabric threads. Now that I'm pinning this curve, I think that will make more sense. The right sides of the fabrics are together, and you can see the long tails of the threads are on the inside. Those are the ones that I will gently pull to gather the ease in. This is not a gathered sleeve, it just has a little ease across the cap, about 2 to 3 inches on either side of the shoulder notch. As you see, I've gathered in more than I need, and I often do that, and then kind of pull it back out into shape. And I want to distribute that as evenly as possible across the top or cap of the sleeve. Gently squeezing the fabric, I run my fingers across it to distribute or redistribute the gathers. You can see I'm kind of pulling in both directions too to make sure that there's kind of a snug fit, that the gathers aren't more than I need or less than I need. Sometimes I don't baste the sleeve, I just sew it in with the machine, but if you baste it in, then you can check everything carefully, make sure it's good, everything aligns, there are not too many puckers in the cap. You don't want any puckers actually, but if I baste it in and then take the pins out, it will sew much more smoothly, the process will go more smoothly, and the outcome is usually much better. These are just in and out basting stitches about 1/2 inch apart. You don't want to make them too far apart because then the fabrics will shift apart from each other. And I'm going right next to the gathering stitch on the inside. Yep, it's going to be fine. Absolutely fine. And tying the threads off on the right side of the fabric. It's just really easy to grab the wrong thread and pull it, and if you do, then it jams the stitches up. You can't gather it. So I usually cut these off. Starting with the underarm seams, right sides together, shoulder notches. And you can see I'm weaving the straight pin in and out so it's very stable. It doesn't shift around while I work. The underarm curve notches. And I usually start at the back of the sleeve and pull those threads, working them up to the top and across the shoulder area. Pulling like that again just to make sure that the length of the armhole and the length of the gathered sleeve are the same. Making sure the edges of the fabrics meet. And taking a good look at what I've done, just to make sure there's no big flaw that I'm overlooking before I stitch it permanently. If you have a free arm on your sewing machine, this is the time to use it. Now I'm starting, as you see, with the facing up. That way, when I get to the top of the sleeve, I can control those gathers. And this is a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch, or whatever you've determined is best for your fabric. As you can see, I'm still spreading the gathers around with my fingers because it's easy for them to slip and create a pleat, and you don't want a pleat. Now I can tell that some of this basting is going to be showing on the outside, so I'll have to take it out. If you can stitch on the far side of the gathering stitches to include the gathering stitches in the seam allowance, that's the best. Then you don't have to worry about taking them out because they won't show. So I'm looking at it carefully to make sure it all looks good before I do a second row of stitching. And the cap's great. There are some basting stitches that show, but that can come out easily. And what you see me doing is breaking the stitch if it doesn't come out smoothly. Some time to pull this type of gathering stitch out can mar the fabric. So if the fabric's fragile, rather than pull a long piece of thread out, I take the seam ripper and lay it under the stitch and pop the stitches about every ½ inch. And that way they lift out very easily without having to pull them for a long distance. There are no pleats at the top, just slight gathers. Not really even gathers, just what we call ease. And then stitching again in the middle of that seam allowance, which is about 1/4 inch away from the edge. This puts the two seam allowances together so that they can be pressed away from the body and they'll stay in that orientation. If I didn't do this stitch and then finish the edge, the seam could easily spread open, and in pressing would leave a lot of bad pressing, and it would look bad from the outside while being worn. And repeating the same process on the other sleeve. as you can see, I'm stitching at the 1/2 inch, and even though I did the gathering stitches at what seemed to be the 1/2 inch, when I gathered around the cap of the sleeve, because it's a curve, there are places that the fabric will stretch. So even though it seems like I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, when you let go of the fabric, it springs back and you've actually sewn more than 1/2 inch. That's why the stitching from the gathering stitches shows. Now to examine, look how nice and smooth that cap is. And from about 3 inches on either side of the cap to the underarm is perfectly smooth. And here again, even though I stitched these gathering stitches at what seemed to be 1/2 inch, because it's on a curve, it easily stretches and looks narrower than it actually is. And now to finish the edge with a zigzag. This zigzag is about 5 or 6 stitches per inch, and it's pretty wide. It's about 3/16 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. Again, you'd need to take a scrap and test until you find what's best for your fabric and garment. My machine is very old. It's from about 1982. It's a fabulous little machine, all metal, but it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that new machines have. So I want to be pretty general when I tell you what size zigzag and such, because I don't have the same settings that some of the more modern machines have. And I'm cutting off some of the excess frays just so it looks nice and tidy. Once again, embedding all the stitches and seams together with some steam. This helps flatten this seam allowance so it doesn't create a lot of bulk. Pressing the seam allowance into the sleeve area. I'm just going to give it some nice seam, not too much pressure. And as you see, I'm not really touching so much of the sleeve as the seam around the armhole. No pressure. Just steam. This will help set the seam allowance and keep it in place. Yeah, the sleeves look really good. You can see how smooth the seams are. And now to hem it. And this will be a stitched hem, not a faced hem. So what I'm going to do is flip the facing and interfacing back on itself by folding right sides together at the far edge of the garment. If you put a straight pin right there, it just helps you see exactly where that fold is. Pin it together. I'm stitching at about 5/8 of an inch. And I'm stitching, of course, again, right sides together, only in the facing and interfacing area. Sometime, instead of putting a straight pin in that fold, I actually put a little tiny notch there, a little clip. That way the fabric doesn't roll out of place when you start to sew it. Now, starting at the edge of the facing, I'm going to run a line of stitching that will make a nice fold line for me to press up. It's a guideline. Make sure that the side seams go toward the back. Whoops. Make sure the seam allowances underneath are going the correct direction. Actually, they're not toward the back, sorry. They're pressed open. But you want to make sure that they stay in the correct orientation when you do the stay stitching. Lightly pressing. It helps flatten the fabric and also embedding the stitches. Now I'm going to turn this corner . Give it a little press. If that was very bulky fabric, I could trim out some of the facing seam allowance. And now to fold and press on that stitching line. If this curve at the side seams is tight and doesn't press nice and flat, you can clip it, because we'll do one more fold and stitch the fabric down. And here we go, clipping those curves. If you've ever had a shirt with this type of hem and the side seam at the hemline puckered, it's because the seam allowances weren't clipped. And now I'm trimming the excess away from the interfacing and facing area. Not from the body of the garment, but just the facing and interfacing. Those two layers. And a little diagonal snip across the corner. That will just keep that area nice and flat. It won't be bulky with too many layers of fabric. Now I have the one pressed fold. I'll fold it up one more time, and at the center front area it's folded to meet at the same level where the facing is turned back and sewn down. The area I'm pinning right now is relatively straight, and then we have the curve, and because the curve is wider towards the very edge of the fabric, it creates a certain amount of bulk. In industry, they have tools that fold the fabric and stitch it perfectly, but often with a home sewing machine, you have to do a lot of this work by hand. So continue pinning all the way around, folding twice. And this is about a 1/4 inch turn, maybe a fraction more. And now, to make it easier to actually sew with the sewing machine, I want to baste this hem down. It'll be much easier to make a smooth, clean stitch line if first this is basted. And I'll baste in a contrasting thread so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm basting a little bit lower than I will actually stitch. I'd like to stitch right at the top fold. If you stitch in the middle of this final fold up, what will happen is when it's worn and pressed or dry cleaned, the top part will roll down. So you have to stitch your final stitching very close to that top fold. I'm just taking long basting stitches. Going around this curve, especially where the seam is, the high point of the curve, by basting it, it will be extremely helpful when stitching on the sewing machine. And that's good enough to hold it down for the time being. And now I'm actually top stitching. If it's easier for you to work with the folded side up, then do. But I can feel where that top fold is, and I know that I sewed with the red thread right below where I want the stitching line to go. So what I'm doing is just sewing right next to the red thread, a bit higher, just a fraction higher. Also, if you noticed, I did not start at the very edge of the blouse. I started just about where the facing ends. It's usually more successful if you're careful and have enough experience to actually top stitch on the top side of the fabric rather than stitching while you're looking at the folded hem. If you're a beginner, looking at the folded hem makes sense. But you'll find that over time, as you get better at this, if you will stitch on the top side, you'll have a smoother hem. You can even see the impression of the folds as they go under the foot. Now, if you remember, I kind of clipped a little bit around that curve, the first fold up, so that helps spread it, but you can see how tight this is. I'll let go of that basting a little bit so I can smooth this out. Now I'm just making sure that I know exactly where the stitching started on the other side, how much above that fold line, because I want them to match. I want them to be exactly the same from left side to right side. Take a look, make sure everything's actually caught in the stitching, and it is. And pull the threads through and tie them off. I'm taking both threads and threading them through a needle, catching the facing, and pulling out the red thread. So now, just to give this a little steam, to make the hemline lay nice and flat and up the facing area in the center front, I always press as I go, and after this I will start with the buttons and buttonholes. I'm going to be using these beautiful pearl buttons with 4 holes. They're just about 1/2 inch wide or around, and what I do is lay them out visually. And if you notice, I put the top one close to the very edge of the top of the blouse, and the bottom one is not close to the bottom. I like a lot of space between the bottom button and the hem. Visually lay them out and then go back and see what the distance is between them, and of course you'll make all the distances exactly the same. These I laid out pretty well, only the bottom one needs to be adjusted a little bit. But now I can take them away. I'm going to start the first buttonhole just about 3/8 of an inch from the top edge, and right on the 1/2 inch. Well, it's actually 1/2 inch from the edge is the center front. So now I've marked the very top of the buttonhole, and I can now put pins every 3.5 inches. These are 3.5 inches apart. And if your buttonholes or your buttons are smaller, you may want to put them closer together. If they're larger, if you have a deeper extension, then of course you will measure them according to what you have. 1/2 inch or 3/8 inch buttons are perfect for a shirt or a blouse like this. What I'm doing is I want them to go a little bit further down the shirt, so I'm respacing them at 3 inches and 5/8. The top button should start 3/8 to 1/2 inch from the very top edge of the shirt. Now that looks pretty good. The straight pin goes in at the very top of the buttonhole, so the buttonholes will go from the top, from the pin down. And now I'm making sure they're exactly the correct distance from the edge of the fabric, which in this case is 1/2 of an inch. Because every machine is different, you'll have to make some samples with your own buttonhole attachment or whatever ability you have to make buttonholes. Sometimes there's a simple dial that you turn, or if it's electronic, some button that you push to create buttonholes. So you'll have to determine if the buttonhole goes from front to back or from back to front, and the best orientation for you to actually sew these buttonholes. I always make a couple of samples before I make my buttonholes in the garment. Now that I've determined the spacing of the buttonholes, I want to mark this on my pattern for future reference. I'm going to mark the top of the buttonhole for the first 3 buttons, and I'm spacing them at 3 5/8 inches. I'm also going to write that I'm using 5 buttons. You can say what size, 1/2, and how far apart they are spaced, 3 5/8 inches. This way there's no question when I go back to make this blouse again. And now to make a sample for the buttonhole, I'm taking a scrap of the fabric and folding it to have 3 layers like the facing. The facing has the outer layer, the interfacing, and the facing. I'm going to start the buttonhole 1/2 of an inch away from the edge of the folded fabric, as the extension is, and take the button and come down just a little below the button, and that's where I'll stop this buttonhole. We'll see if this is a good size, and if it's not, I'll make as many as it takes to get the perfect size. You want the button to be snug when it goes through, but not too snug, and you also don't want the buttonhole to be so loose that the button comes out easily while the garment's being worn. I'm embedding the needle at the top of the buttonhole, moving the pins to the edge so that the foot of the machine doesn't interfere. And I have to manually stop my machine and do the bar tack at the bottom and then go back up and do the bar tack at the top. This machine is close to 40 years old, so the newer machines have many more attachments or dials that you can use for different kinds of buttonholes. Mine makes a nice buttonhole, but it takes a lot of work to make the buttonholes. I'm putting a straight pin right below the top bar and right above the bottom bar. That way when I put my seam ripper in and slice through the fabric, it stops inside the buttonhole. It doesn't continue and create a hole in the garment. This buttonhole's a snug, a little bit too snug. Even with clipping it a little bit, it's just a little too tight. So I'm going to make another one. This one I'll make about 3/16 of an inch longer than the button. That's a really good buttonhole. Again, I'm going to take the straight pin, put right under the bar, and you don't really need one at the bottom if you stab the fabric above the bar. Slide it up to the straight pin and push your button through. This is a good size. Now I know the size of each buttonhole, and what I'll do so that I don't have to deal with straight pins is mark with a single thread the top bar of the buttonhole and the bottom bar. And I know that each buttonhole is exactly 1/2 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, keeping in mind that women's garments button with the buttonholes on the right side of the garment. In other words, the right side of your body. And men's usually open with the buttonholes on the left side of the garment. Another thing with buttons, it's traditional to use odd numbers. Certainly even numbers can be used, but I often follow this rule of using an odd number. Somehow it just seems to have a better balance visually. And just to be absolutely sure I have it correct, I'm going to double check everything. And now to make my buttonholes. If you're a novice at this, you might consider starting with the buttonhole at the bottom and working your way up. Sometimes I find I get better at making them as I go along, so I start at the bottom, which is less obvious. You can see by having the basting threads go way past the actual buttonhole, it's easier for me to gauge when to start and stop. You can also see that as I go through them, I get a little faster. So if you start at the bottom and work up, your most beautiful buttonhole will be at the top, and that's the most seen buttonhole up by the face. So pull out the basting threads. If they get stuck, then cut them. And now to open the buttonholes, just as I showed you before. If you have very, very small scissors, you also can fold the buttonhole in half and snip the middle of it, and then use the scissors to snip to either direction. And now to mark where the buttons go. I'm overlapping the right front with the buttonholes over the left front and aligning the center fronts. I'm taking a straight pin and stabbing it through the middle of that top button and on down the row. I'll straighten these up with my measuring tape in a moment. Now the measurement between the buttons is the same as the measurement between the buttonholes, but I want the button to land in the middle of the buttonhole. So once I'm happy with the top button, I can move down the row, measuring 3 5/8 inches between each one and 1/2 of an inch away from the edge. So taking a double thread, running it through the beeswax, and a good small knot at the end, I'm going to put my needle right where that straight pin goes in. That's the middle of the button. You can either go across making a little bit of an X, or you can go from hole to hole, up and down vertically or across. It's your choice. I'm not sewing the buttons terribly snug to the body of the garment. I'm leaving a little tiny bit of space so that the fabric that buttons over it will actually fit. It won't be too snug. And as you see on the back side, I'm coming through, but I'm trying to come through with the stitches close enough that they don't look sloppy. And then I circle the button around 2 or 3 times to reinforce it. So let's do this again. Put your needle right in where the straight pin is. These are up and down, not across. I'm going in twice into each hole, or 3 or 4 times if you feel like it's necessary. But this is a very fragile blouse. It's not going to be worn like a work shirt. Go around 3 times, 4 times, and then take your needle to the back and run it through. You don't really need to knot it, because once you've run it through once or twice, it will stay, especially with the wax. And continue on down the blouse. I like having the knot under the button because then it doesn't show. Wrapping the thread around like this really helps reinforce the button so that the buttonhole over time doesn't wear through the threads that you first put through. That wrapping really makes it much stronger. These buttonholes are a little snug, so what I'm going to do is snip as close to that bar tack as I can. If I can snip just a little tiny bit more, the buttons will slide through a little more easily. This fabric's been a joy to work with. And we have a blouse.